I'm your new host, Jasmine Thorne, joining you for the next 4 weeks.
And I'm Clare Abbots. Thank God Jacob is finally gone. Or is he? Yes, he is.
Later in the show, we'll be showing an experimental short film, and we'll take a look at the latest Marvel film, Thor: The Dark World.
But first, we'd like to introduce today's guest host, the host of Turning Points with Shaun Bindley on 31 Digital. Obviously, it's Shaun Bindley. Welcome to the show.
Hey Claire, how you going? Jasmine?
Hey.
So could you tell us a bit about Turning Points? What was your inspiration behind the show?
I've presented a number of shows here over the years, and I'd always been interested in this notion that there are moments in people's lives that will affect them down the track, and oftentimes you don't realise that that moment's actually passing. Sometimes you do. You have a decision where you can say, okay, I'm going to do this or I'm going to do that. Oftentimes people don't have the luxury of actually taking control of that decision. So I was interested in talking to people who'd had experiences like that, and I've had a lot of them in my life as well, where they could look back on how things had changed, whether they'd actually been able to control that decision, whether that decision had been taken out of their hands, how they'd actually dealt with the consequences of that decision as well. Some really interesting guests.
Yeah, there's quite a variety of guests on the show, because I know Priscilla was a guest who actually actively made her choice, in a way, I suppose.
Priscilla she was conceived in Billawheeler. Mm-hmm. And at that stage in Australia in the early 70s, they were using 2,4,5-T as a defoliant. Mm-hmm. So they were spraying it all over the town. And she was born without a fibula in her leg and spent 27 odd years walking around in pain. Mm-hmm. Always visiting with her specialist, and after it was just getting worse and worse, it got to the stage where she would get off the train from work and get in a cab in order to go the 200 metres to get home. And she was speaking to her specialist, with whom she'd meet twice a year, and eventually a specialist said to her, have you ever thought about just cutting it off? And she went, well, no, I didn't know that I could, but leave it with me. And she went off and she did her due diligence and she did the research and she made an informed decision about what would be better for her, and she had her leg amputated in order for her to be able to live a pain-free life, which is what she does now.
Wow.
And of course she went on from there and created these art installations all around the world made out of prosthetic limbs that had been turned into art. She's a remarkable person. And that's a classic example of how somebody can take charge of their decision or this moment in their life, and it can take them off somewhere else that they never could have dreamed of. Yeah,
you have so many fascinating guests on there, but people like that who have had such major things happen often don't even recognise themselves. They're just like, it's something I did, and they're quite humble about it. So how did you even go about finding these amazing stories?
Well, we sort of, Nigel Brennan was probably a classic example that Nigel had been in the press a fair bit, and he just released a new book, and obviously there's people out there interested in doing promotion and stuff, and Nigel had been doing the rounds, and we asked him if he'd be interested in coming on the show, and he was happy to do that, and that was a great story. That's how we opened the show. Nigel had travelled to Somalia with a journalist from Canada to do a story on the Somalian refugee camps, and without spoiling too much of the story, they ended up being kidnapped by Somali teenagers and held captive in Mogadishu for 15 months. And they were beaten, and Amanda, who was the journalist who was with him, she was repeatedly sexually assaulted, and the Australian government did nothing to help them get out. Wow. They actually managed to escape from where they were being held, and then were recaptured in a mosque and beaten with AK-47s and carried through the streets of Mogadishu over these teenagers' heads and locked in manacles for another 12 months, I think.
How did they get back?
Eventually, their family spoke to a guy. I describe him as a Russell Crowe type, as that type of character who, when you've been kidnapped in South America or wherever, you get the $1 million together and you give it to that dude, and he comes in with all guns blazing and he rescues you. Yeah. Wasn't quite as dramatic as that, but once Nigel's family realised that they really weren't getting anywhere, and it had been 14 months and nobody was helping them, they were given this guy's number. He'd recently been involved in the rescue of another hostage, and they rang him up and said, "This is the situation. We don't know how to move forward from this. Do you think you can help us?" And he said, "Yeah, of course I can. How much money have you got?" And then they said, "Well, we've got about 450. And he said, "Well, I think you need another 150, and I should be able to get them free for that." And they said, "Well, we're completely tapped out. We don't know where we can go to get any more money." And he said, "Well, here's a list of benefactors who've been known to help out people in your situation. Why don't you just start calling from the top, tell them your situation, and see if anybody's willing to help you out." Dick Smith was the first guy on the top of the list. Wow. They rang him up and said, "This is the story," and he literally said, "Okay, who would you like me to make the check out for, and how much do you need? And they were freed 3 days later.
That's amazing.
After 14 months of being locked up.
Yeah. So the episode that aired this week was Pacific Hajinamano's episode, and I guess he had a similar sort of having to flee from his country.
I mean, Pacific was probably, it was when I used to live in Coorparoo, and there's a big African community on the sort of inner southern suburbs of Brisbane, a lot of Somalians. And I'd seen a young African guy just down at Stones Corner, and he had a massive scar down the side of his face, all the way down here, and it couldn't look to me like anything other than somebody had hit him in the side of the head with a machete. And I remember looking at him going, what's happened to your life that you're here now, standing at a bus stop in Stones Corner, going wherever you're going, with this massive scar, and the journey that you've taken to come along to get to this point, and what you've dealt with? Have you made the decisions? Were you in charge of what was going on in your life when you got caught in this altercation? And how did you get to Australia? So Pacific was a classic example. I really wanted to speak to an African refugee and see what it was like, the journey that they took to get here. And Pacific was, he was 8 years old in Rwanda when the Hutus and the Tutsis took machetes to each other.
Gosh.
Bombs landed in his backyard and his family all bolted. And it took about 14 years later before he was actually able to get refugee status here in Australia. Ultimately, it needed him to be in a refugee camp in Zambia with the guy who murdered his father in front of him, living in the tent next to him, making threats to him, before anybody would actually say, okay, we do believe that you have the grounds for refugee status here to Australia, and he's here a couple of days later. Yeah, it's a remarkable story.
Wow. That's one of those, like the classic turning point of if he'd just gone a different direction, like to his father or to his mother, it could have ended up so amazing.
It was literally like that. It was a very convoluted and very mixed up situation because there was a lot of misinformation going on about who was saying what and who was in charge. The political powers at the time were actually putting words into the opposition. So it was very hard for the people in Rwanda to work out actually what was actually happening in their country.
It must be quite an intense experience for you to have to interview people with such a really intense story like that as well. Did you find it difficult at times to?
We did a lot of work, a lot of research getting into this, and I don't think after 78 episodes of Meet the Ministers here on Bris 31 anything could be that harder, because some of them are a little dry.
Oh yeah.
Oh, well, that was amazing. But that's all we have time for right now. Up after the break, we'll be airing an experimental short film, and we'll continue chatting to Shaun Bindley. Don't go away.